Hi. Hey, good to see you. Yeah. My pleasure. I'm very happy to be here. I'm just amazed that all these people are like. It's a gorgeous day in Aspen. They want to talk about the budget deficit.
I guess it's testament to you, but we always try to.
All right, everybody, we'll get going here. Everyone, welcome, and thank you for coming. My name's John Allen. I'm with Booz Allen Hamilton, and it's exciting to be here in the Booz Allen room. Booz Allen's been a real great partner and sponsor with Aspen for over 20 years now, and it's exciting to actually be inside the Booz Allen room. A couple housekeeping tips here. First off, this panel is how do we reduce the deficit and still invest in a growth economy? So if you want to be in a panel on happiness, this is not the place. So the other housekeeping tip is if you have a cell phone, could you please put it on stun as it does interfere with the sound system. So I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jimmy Henry, who will then introduce the rest of the panel here. Jimmy is an executive vice president at Booz Allen Hamilton. He's the market lead for our civil business, and he's a member of the firm leadership team. Previously, Jimmy was the firm's economic and business analysis capability lead. He leads a team of over 6,000 staff supporting our civil and government clients, which include the financial and entitlement businesses. We have an exciting panel here today. It's quite diverse topics on this, and we all look forward to hearing what people have to say. So, Jimmy?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. We were sort of curious what kind of draw this would be. We knew we had some real top talent here, but it's gratifying to see everybody here with us this morning. I'm not sure that there could be any more of a pressing topic facing all of us in terms of how we as a nation can get our arms around spending, yet be able to increase revenue so that we bring some balance back into our fiscal house. While doing that, basically keeping an economy growing and taking care of the needs of citizens that are really in need of assistance. So it's a tough juggling act. You know it, I know it, our panelists know it. This is an opportunity for them to share their views with us and actually for you to ask some questions of the panel on segments of their views. As you know, President Obama chartered the National Commission on Fiscal Responsibility and Reform to try to get absolutely at the heart of this and provide bipartisan recommendations on which our nation might act. And it was certainly, as you know, co-chaired by one of our panelists, Senator Alan Simpson, and the other co-chair, Erskine Bowles. Additionally, if you are awake most days, there's an unbelievable degree of activity going on, led by Vice President Biden, Speaker Boehner, certainly involving the president in terms of coming to grips really immediately with some things that are forcing this issue in terms of raising a debt limit versus coming to agreement. So this thing is front and center. You know, it's facing every one of us. I'm not sure there could be a more timely topic than this, and we are fortunate to have these folks with us. So let me make a few quick introductions. I'll start with Senator Alan Simpson, who was the co-chair of that National Commission, a 3-term senator from Wyoming, a distinguished lecturer. He held a position as the director of the Institute of Politics at Harvard's JFK School, and he runs his own law firm and certainly is one who has views steeped in many, many years right at the forefront of these topics, so Senator Simpson. On my far left, Jared Bernstein, a senior fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, most recently served as Vice President Biden's chief economist. That sounds like a pretty cool spot, by the way. And a member of the president's economic team, another cool spot. For those of you that know him in another way, certainly he's an on-air commentator at MSNBC, CNBC, an active blogger and well-regarded, well-renowned author. On my immediate left, Al Hubbard, the co-founder and CEO of E&A Industries, Al is an entrepreneur and business person. He does have interesting political connections too, in that he served in the White Houses of both George H.W. Bush and more recently George W. Bush. For President Bush, George H.W. Bush, he was the executive director of the President's Council on Competitiveness, and for George W., assistant to the President for Economic Policy and director of the National Economic Council. He, like the other folks, serves on numerous boards and nonprofit institutions. So the backgrounds, I don't think, could be any richer or more diverse to get this thing going in a vigorous kind of way. So let me just put a few quick facts out here to help frame this. Tax revenues in this nation are approximately 15% of the gross domestic product, the lowest it's been in 60 years. Federal spending is running at about 24% of GDP, leading to a budget deficit of 9% of the GDP. Our federal debt has increased from about 33% of GDP to 60% in the last 10 years. It's clear that without actions taken soon, if those trends continue or variations of those trends continue, you could end up with total debt approaching 60 to 90% of our GDP, a territory in which we certainly don't want to find ourselves. It's clear that entitlement spending and interest on debt exacerbate those problems. We have a 9.1% unemployment rate. So there's certainly a budget deficit issue, but there's a jobs deficit issue. So listen, when you say all that and you read all that, I don't know how you think about it, but it's scary. These are intractable kind of things. However, historically, our nation has been able to take on things like this and tougher and actually get to stuff. So in our discussions among the four of us, we have said, yes, this stuff's hard, but let's not despair. Hard things are what we as a nation do well. I'm not saying it's easy. If it was easy, we would have done it. But I think in the discussion today, you'll find, hey, there's probably some light at the end of the tunnel, and it, in fact, is not a coal train coming at us at full speed. So I'd like to just open it up to our panelists. I think a reasonable person looking at all this would say, okay, this is the time to act. We can wait no longer. What do you all say about this, and can we actually fix this? So this is our open-ended stuff. And maybe we start with Senator Simpson, please. He knew I was going to do that.
No, I didn't.
That's a head fake that he just used, trust me.
I played basketball. I knew about head fakes. Let me tell you first, it's a great honor to be here, and I thank you. Erskine and I often leave our witness protection program, and he couldn't come, and he sent me forward. I said, Erskine, that's one of the greatest guys I've ever met. He is very special. He's the last guy that was involved in balancing a budget. A sick idea, I know, but he did that. And so I want to thank all of you involved in this tremendous program. There's so much to learn from so many here and so many to learn from. We're really privileged. Everybody in this room is a privileged person. I think we forget that sometimes, and it's easy to forget sometimes in a setting like this. Beautiful people, wonderful thoughts, but lots of stuff going on in America with the little guy that is pretty tough. And I listened to Robert Rubin this morning. Terrific what he says, what he does. He speaks truth to power. It's tough. In politics, there are no right answers, only a continuing flow of compromises among groups, resulting in a changing, cloudy, and ambiguous series of public decisions where appetite and ambition compete openly with knowledge and wisdom. And that's all it is. And it's a wonderful thing to witness. I've been in it. But where we are right now, we never had a war without a specific tax to pay for it, even the revolution. Now we have 2 wars and a quarter war, or whatever that is, with no tax to support it. That's impossible. It can't work. It's a joke. It's a lie. It's a trick on the American people, and it's costing a bundle. And you can't get there on the other stuff without whacking on Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and assuring the solvency of Social Security. The rest of it is babble, absolute babble. We've never had a war without a tax to support it since the Revolution, ever. We're now fighting 2 wars in 2/10, apparently, of a war. I don't know, I haven't counted it, and no tax to support them. Our group, Erskine and I, 18 of us, we had 105 groups testify before us. Every one of them said there was a serious, serious problem in this country, and then said, as they left, don't touch mine. Don't touch this, 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 and this. And so you have to name names here, and it's not a cruel, but I talked to Grover Norquist. We don't have the most charitable visits, but we talk. He said in testimony, he said, my hero is Ronald Reagan. I said, God, isn't that something? So is mine. I said, that's terrific, Grover. I said, he raised taxes 11 times in his administration, Grover. What do you think of that? And he said, I didn't like that at all. Well, I said, not the issue whether you liked it or not. He did that during his tenure. And to paraphrase Lloyd Benson years ago, he said, I knew Ronald Reagan, and you're no Ronald Reagan, I said. And I said, why do you suppose we did that? Well, it was to make the country run. It's a sick idea is to have taxes to make the country run. So here we are. We had a terrific job, and we had a vote of 10 of the 18 who voted for the package. It's a tough package. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, 1 independent voted for it. I tried to find out where it all is. The credit ratings now, the credit people, all are perched to wait and see what we do before August 2nd. Fitch, Standard & Poor, Moody's, and here we are. And I guess we'll find out here, if we've forgotten that we're Americans first instead of members of groups, we ain't got a prayer. And if we're in thrall, that's a great 2 words, it's not 1 word. Lincoln used it beautifully, in thrall. If we are in thrall to people who give us the business and misquote figures, we'll never make it. Because you can't get there without doing something with Medicare, Medicaid, solvency of Social Security, and defense. So it's a pleasure to share this, but the time for BS is gone, and the time for slogans is gone, and everybody's going to take a hit. Everybody in this room is going to take a hit, and it's not a pleasant time. We'll find out who has the best advice to us without giving us a bunch of song and dance. So I'm ready to, you can ask any questions. I enjoy that. I have effectively reached life's ultimate goal. I'll be 80, and I now have, as I said to my wife, a lilt in my step, because I have effectively pissed off everybody in America.
We're going to do the questions later on, so just hold on. Listen, when we formed this up, and after I talked to the senator, I realized this was going to be a piece of cake because there's no holds barred, and he lets her rip all the time, which is fabulous. Jared, how about your views on some of this timeliness and action?
Thank you. First of all, I'm amazed to see everybody here on one of the most beautiful days and one of the most beautiful places on earth. You've decided to come and talk about the budget deficit for an hour. So you're my kind of people. I'm reminded of this interesting article that while we were in the White House, there was a profile of Larry Summers done in the New Yorker. And there was one part I really liked where Larry was talking about the kinds of economic questions that influence him, and somehow someone asked him about, what are some other kinds of things that interest you? And he said, I don't know, I stand in my kitchen and I look out at the backyard and I see it's green, but it doesn't pose any interesting questions to me. And I could kind of relate to that as well. Look, Senator Simpson said it all very eloquently. And I think if I can add any value to that, perhaps it's getting a little bit down into the weeds and talking about this in a way that is, I hope, pragmatic and introduces some of the economics of the situation, including some metrics that need to be considered. We talk about budget deficits as if they're a bad thing. And no question that an unsustainable fiscal trajectory is a very bad thing. But there are times when budget deficits are very important. This was an insight of Keynes that's been valid ever since the Great Depression. But there was a meeting in Washington sometime after the Depression where a bunch of Democratic economists were sitting around with Keynes himself and arguing that the budget deficit wasn't large enough to support economic growth. And Keynes pointed out to them, "You're more Keynesian than I am." There is a time for budget deficits and a time for significant and large budget deficits. It's critically important to help the economy get over this chasm, this gap in aggregate demand that was so devastating to so many people, as you heard Jimmy talk about in the introduction. But once that gap is behind us, once that baton of demand is ready to be passed back to the private sector, and by the way, that time is not here yet, but it's approaching, we have to get the budget deficit under control. What does that mean? Well, at first blush, it means the debt to GDP ratio. The debt as a share of our economy can't simply go up year after year after year. That is the definition of unsustainable. If the debt as a share of our economy is going up every year, as the trajectory is, by the way, if you look at where things are headed, we will crowd out so many other important functions of government and lead to all kinds of havoc in markets here and globally. In order to get the debt stable as a share of the economy, budget deficits can't be any larger than 3% of GDP. If budget deficits are larger than 3% of GDP, debt rises as a share of the economy. If they're lower than that, debt begins to contract. So our first proximate goal needs to be to get the budget deficit down below 3% of GDP once the economic recovery is on solid footing. Note that that's not zero, and that's important. There's no imperative to balance the budget in the short, or definitely in the short term, but even in the medium term. Heading toward balanced budget is absolutely imperative. But getting there is not necessary to stabilize and even bring down debt as a share of the economy. Okay, how do we get there? That's where the Fiscal Commission did so much important work, and perhaps we'll talk about that more during the discussion. In my view, it's not rocket science, but there's lots of oxes to be gored, as the senator said. You heard Bob Rubin, others continue to make this point, that the part of the budget that everybody seems to want to go after, it's discretionary spending that's not related to defense, is 12%. And in fact, you can't go there. The entitlements absolutely have to be on the table. But here's I have two more points to make, and this is one of them, and then I'll get out of the way. As you heard in Senator Simpson's talk, and I believe in Bob Rubin's talk this morning, we can't get there without revenues, without tax revenues, increased tax revenues being part of the solution. We cannot get there without increases in tax revenues. And anyone who tells you that is extremely misguided and, in my view, doesn't have the best interest of the nation in hand. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that you have to raise tax rates. You can broaden the base by closing tax loopholes and keep tax rates where they are. But be very cautious of this in the following sense. People will often say, I'm for broadening the base. That means closing loopholes and collecting more tax revenue. But I also want to lower the rates. I want to broaden the base and lower the rates. They talk about this a lot in the corporate tax. Corporate tax reform, broaden the base, lower the rates. The president himself has talked about this. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but remember, once you start lowering the rates, you're giving up the revenue that you gain through broadening the base. So it's one thing to talk about broadening the tax base. It's another to talk about lowering tax rates, because if you really want to reduce the deficit, you have to take those revenues you're getting from broadening the base and use them for deficit reduction. If you lower the rates, you're giving them back. I can say more about that in the discussion, but it's an important thing to keep in your mind, because I really think where this deficit, the current budget talks are going is in that direction. I think revenues will be part of the deal, and I think those revenues will come from these kinds of base broadeners. But what about raising tax rates? I mean, it has become a mantra of economics, mostly conservative economics, but economics in general, that if we tweak one tax rate up 0.1%, the economy will crash, everybody will lose their job, and havoc will reign, and boils and poison ivy will break out everywhere. There is no empirical evidence to support this, and quite to the contrary. Just go back to the Clinton years. We had a tax structure that was more progressive, where tax rates were higher. We certainly collected more revenue. We had a much better job market. I mean, we had, and much more, as you heard Ruben say, much more broadly shared growth. So just based on two experiments, an experiment with a more progressive tax code of the type I would argue we need right now. It does include some higher rates, particularly at the higher end, during the 90s. And then the 2000s, a very, very deep and I think excellent pseudo-experiment, which we don't have enough of in economics, of testing supply-side trickle-down economics. You really had a great experiment. The 90s with a more progressive tax code, the 2000s with much more of a this anti-tax kind of Norquist view. And the outcomes, and I can detail them during Q&A if you want to, are remarkably different. I mean, job growth was much worse in the 2000s. Income growth, much worse. The stock market even did worse. So I would be very, very critical of this notion that you can never, ever raise tax rate. Final point. You heard the senator say, you know, this is what it's going to take to get there. And this is the way we talk about this a lot. We need to get from here to there. I'd like us to think for a minute in this gorgeous setting. Where's there? What is it that we as a nation believe the size and role of government ought to be? I mean, that's the first discussion we have to have, and then we can talk about how we amply fund it. But if we actually believe in a government that does social insurance, that protects the vulnerable, that basically looks at what the market does best and what the market does least well, by the way, I would put provision of health care in the least well category, what the market does best and what the market does least well, and take those least well categories and provide them through an amply funded government, that gets us a good part of the way there. So let's figure out where's there and how we pay for it. I know it sounds easy when you say it that way.
Thanks, Jared. Al Hubbard.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity to be here, and also want to point out what Senator Simpson and his Erskine and his commission did was truly remarkable, and I think their proposal is very, very good. I only have one disappointment. With it, and that is that the president didn't embrace it. But Jared told me this morning that over time he's becoming much more open-minded to it. I can't resist just responding very briefly to something Jared said, and I'm sure we will have more opportunity to go back and forth. But
here we go.
The 1980s, if you look at the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan inherited stagflation and there was a dramatic cut in taxes and regulations and marginal tax rates, and we had a remarkably strong economy. So, we will have a lot of opportunity to talk about tax burdens and marginal tax rates. We all know we're facing the biggest economic challenge we've faced since the Great Depression. Its magnitude's greater than anything we've seen since World War II. And it comes down, and it's been said, it comes down to two things: economic growth and the deficit. I'm going to repeat a little bit what people said, but just to give it some context, and it's really consistent with what Alan Simpson and Jared have said, is the debt to GDP is extremely important. We're at 60% of GDP today. A few years ago, we were at 30% of GDP. The Congressional Budget Office says we will be at 100% of GDP in 2021, and that's with, in my mind, some optimistic assumptions in terms of growth and optimistic assumptions in terms of the cost of Obamacare. Economists will tell us, they tell us that when we reach 90%, economic growth slows dramatically, and we move into an area where you'll end up in a quagmire like Japan, like Greece, like several other European countries are bordering on, where it's very hard to get out of the situation you find yourselves in. So the bottom line is we have to, and consistent with what Senator Simpson was saying, no more slogans. We have to deal with the deficit. We have to. And the remarkable thing is it's very clear what has to be done. Now, there'll be debates about revenue raising, but on the cutting side, there really aren't debates. Social Security has to be put on a sound footing, and it's simple to do. I spent a year trying to get Social Security reform passed in Congress and couldn't even get a committee hearing back in 2005, so it shows you how effective I was on Capitol Hill. But here's all you have to do. I mean, it's not easy, but it's got to be done. You've got to raise the retirement age. It's in the commission report. And you've got to change the benefit formula so middle income and upper income people, the adjustment, the indexation, which is now tied to wage growth, if you change it to inflation, you will balance Social Security and get it on sound footing. Medicare, that's the most difficult one. For 30 years, we've tried to deal with Medicare through try to find fraud, waste, and abuse, and also reducing provider reimbursements, and we have failed for 30 years, both sides of the aisle. There's not that much of the former that we can find, and with respect to provider reimbursements, what happens is the providers go back to Congress and they get the cuts restored. Happens every time. The doc fix is a perfect example. Every administration always fixes doctor cuts. And then a third area that no one likes to talk about, and I'm sure I will. I'm not sure I'll have anyone who will support me on this, but I'll throw it out. Hopefully you won't hiss at me. But it is revenue sharing. The federal government sends over $600 billion a year to states and localities for activities that states and localities should have responsibility for. And it is an extremely inefficient system. The federal government takes a big cut of the pie, sends it, and then attaches huge regulations to these activities. For example, a friend of mine runs our bus system in Indianapolis. He says he would be 25% more efficient if he didn't have the federal government regulations. Talk to anyone with Medicaid and all the regulations that exist. $600 billion could be eliminated if we would turn that back to the states and localities. And these are things that need to be done. But there's no reason we should send our money to Washington and have it come back to the states and localities. These are such things as education, such things as Medicaid, such things as unemployment insurance, such things as food stamps, very important things, but why do we do it the way we do it? And you're talking about a big savings. And then finally, defense. There's no question we need to go after the defense dollar. $700 billion, we know there's a lot of opportunity for dramatically improving the efficiency of the Department of Defense. But we also, imperative is that we look at economic growth. And I would be interested if Jared agrees with me on this, but unfortunately, we're in a very difficult situation that we haven't faced since World War II. This is the first recession we've had that's a credit contraction recession. And history shows us when credit contraction causes a recession, we come out of it very, very slowly. Not like in the early 80s, where we came out very rapidly, had 7% growth, and unemployment would drop 2 or 3% in a single year. In a credit contraction recovery, normally you don't go back to the original trend line. You start from where you are and you grow at the normal rate, which is 2.5 to 3%, and unemployment therefore remains high for a long period of time. And I think most economists on both sides of the aisle agree, unfortunately, and no one would like to agree with this, that that's the situation we find ourselves in. That doesn't mean that we aren't making mistakes and that there are things we can do to enhance economic growth. Getting the debt under control and giving people confidence we're going to get it under control is number one. But here are a couple other things. Obviously, keeping tax burden low, keeping regulatory burden low. But housing, the Bush administration and the Obama administration have dealt with housing totally 180-degree wrong. We in the Bush administration and the Obama administration have tried to prevent housing prices from falling. Well, the marketplace is always going to win. Always going to win. So what's happened? We've delayed the decline of housing prices. And as long as housing prices are declining, the economy is not going to be strong. The government needs to get out of the way, let housing prices fall to wherever they're going to fall, and then you will see a dramatic turn in not dramatic, but you will see a turn in our attitude towards our homes, our net worth, and in buying homes. Why would anyone buy a home today if they know a year from now it's going to be worth less than it is today? And for most people who buy homes, it's the bulk of their net worth. Unemployment insurance. You know, we pay people for 2 years now for unemployment insurance. So we're paying them for 2 years not to work. That's a little bit of a rough statement, and it's obviously people are still looking for jobs. But we ought to find a different system where we don't encourage them not to find jobs. They need to be helped, but studies show that people find jobs right before their unemployment insurance runs out. We need to look at reforming the unemployment program. And then finally, this is in the commission report, and I think they do a beautiful job of it, we've got to reform the tax system. Our tax system is truly counterproductive to economic growth. We've got to get rid of all of those, as many as possible. In a perfect world, in my perfect world, we'd get rid of all of them, but as many as possible, and I realize with politics it can't be all of them. We need to get rid of all the deductions, the tax credits, the loopholes, et cetera, and lower the rates to the mid-20s. That would have an incredibly positive impact on economic growth. And the good news is that both sides of the aisle are talking about it. The bad news is it's very difficult because everyone's ox will be gored if we do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. So no surprise that we get a divergence of views on this. That's the spice of this. It's a clear indication of the degree of difficulty. As I said at the beginning, if it was easy, we would have figured it out already. I thought the framework for, I'd like to ask them only one question and then let you ask at will. I thought the right framework for that is using the Deficit Commission recommendations, because it does get at the heart of this. It's not agreeing with everything that's in there, but it's a great framework for it. So I'm sure most of you have read it or skimmed it in some sense, but let me just give you a couple of quick. It's a 6-part plan comprised of, number 1, discretionary spending caps and cuts. Number 2, comprehensive tax reform. Rates, broadened base, simplified corporate tax. Number 3, healthcare cost containment. Number 4, mandatory savings, decreases in certain subsidies and reform of selected retirement systems. Number 5, fix Social Security, yet keep an eye on reduction of poverty and supporting those who really need the support. And number 6 is more of a structural reform, the budget process. Now, if you saw the report over about a 10-year period, that the recommendations led to about $4 trillion of reductions. It enumerated or estimated the cost of each of those 6. So I'll put that aside. Yes, that's an indication of the relative merits of it, but I'd like to ask each of our 3 panelists. I know, we could talk about each of the 6. We'd be here for weeks, which probably wouldn't be so bad for me living in the East Coast, but we've got a timetable. So I'd like each of our colleagues, if you had to pick one of those, I know you can't do it that way, is one of those is that going to be really putting a dagger in the heart of this more than the others, or does it have to be across the board? I'm sort of curious. You all are close to it. I know I'm simplifying. Are there 1 or 2 of these that are the absolute gotta have, or if we don't do those, game over? So let me start this one with Jared, and we'll mix it up a little bit.
Look, it is impossible to attain a sustainable, long-term fiscal situation in this country without reducing the amount that we spend on health care. It's not just a public sector issue. It's not just Medicare or Medicaid. In fact, it's worse in the private sector. Costs are rising faster in the private sector. Believe it or not, those government programs that take such a hit, in many cases deservedly, there's waste, have an increase in costs that's considerably less than that in the private sector. It's actually more inefficient. So let me just say, we can take a very important lesson from the Fiscal Commission that I don't think has been appreciated enough on the panel and the discussion today. One of the things the Fiscal Commission laid out on page 1 or 2 in their principles, which is, to me, one of the best parts of the document, was what we do to get our nation's fiscal situation under control cannot hurt vulnerable people. You heard Senator Simpson talk about the poverty. Actually, Bob Rubin did as well. Cannot hurt the vulnerable. And so if you go after education, unemployment insurance, food stamps, housing, all areas where some of our most vulnerable people have been deeply hurt, not only will you not be addressing the problem, that's a sideshow. You'll be violating a key principle of the Fiscal Commission. So what I would bite off, Jimmy, is absolutely the health care piece. I think the Affordable Care Act has some great components that are promising in that regard. And I can say more about that when we want to. I know that's taken a hit lately in lots of the criticism, but I actually think that's the way to go.
Al Hubbard, how about you? What do you think?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is Medicare, and I failed to point something out in my initial statement, and it happens to be in Medicare that I would like to point out. I pointed out that we have failed in the traditional approach of getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse and cutting provider reimbursements, which is impossible. And I think the only proposal out there, and I wish there were more, and I hope there will be more, that actually holds water is Paul Ryan's proposal with basically a premium support program to deal with Medicare. And by the way, there's an example of it. We've actually done it, and it's actually worked. In Medicare Part D, which is the new program that provides Medicare for drugs, it's a premium support program. It's where each senior goes out and buys his or her own insurance with a subsidy from the federal government, and they can buy rich insurance or low-cost insurance, whatever they want, and the insurance companies compete over it. The result is that the costs have been, and I checked this morning, these are government numbers, 42% less than originally projected by Medicare. And that's because we have harnessed each of senior to be a wise consumer because their money is at risk too. But yet the majority of the money is coming from the federal government. And this is what Paul Ryan wants to do. But if there was one thing we need to deal with, because it's the hardest thing we need to deal with, we've got to deal with Medicare. And by the way, Jared is absolutely right. Healthcare is broken not just on the public side, which is about half of healthcare, it's also broken on the private side. But fixing it on the public side will help fix it on the private side. I have some ideas on the private side that are diametrically opposed to Jared's, but we can talk about them another time.
Thank you, Al. Senator Simpson.
Well, it was very difficult for the group. When we started, it took us 3 months just to talk civilly to each other. Because the Republicans were saying, oh, you know, everything is roses and you don't have to cut anything. The Democrats said, you're not going to cut anything while we're here. And finally, Erskine and I said, we got a great idea. We're going to do a 2-person report. We don't give a crap what the rest of you are going to do. And they said, well, you wouldn't do that. And we said, yes, we would. Erskine's the last guy to balance the budget in the United States history when he was with Clinton. He knows what to do. And he's a genial giant of a man. I'm a little more rambunctious, but I'll tell you, you can't get there unless you deal with Medicare. This is absolute crazy. Some of the richest people in this country are paying not a nickel. Now, I don't know what country you can get that from, but it's certainly not called democracy in my mind. You have a situation where there's no means testing at all. We found situations of people who could buy out half the building here, who pay $1,800 for a $300,000 operation. Something awful sick about that, in my mind, at least. Being a Wyoming cowboy and living there all my life, we really do know what BS is. So somehow, the gimmickry in the system is ripping it to bits. And we couldn't even wrap our arms around it. No affluence testing of any real nature. And when you want to get a copy of your bill, if you felt like a good citizen, like if you were loaded and could pay a little, you can't get the bill. They say you're on Medicaid, or Medicare rather. Medicaid's a different situation. Their money is not at risk, and yet they're the ones that come and bitch all day about the government. It's It's really amazing. All day long, they're bitching about their government, and all day long, they're hosing the government, especially people over 70. Now, I'm 80 next month. They never found out that I was 78 when I had prostate cancer 10 years ago. Everything works. No need to ask personal questions. So I had insurance all those years, 78 years, paying my own insurance. And they found out I'd never been to a hospital before. When I had the treatment, I was an outpatient, so I never stayed overnight. When they found out then, when I went in for a knee surgery, they said, well, you should be on Medicare. I said, I don't want to be on Medicare. I've got my own insurance. They said, well, you used to have your own insurance. Your insurance is canceled. You're now on Medicare. How absurd. So for 78 years, I got along, paying my premiums, and then they threw me into Medicare. I'm going to try to pay for the operation myself. It's about 16 grand for my knee. I can't. I'm on Medicare, regardless of my net worth or my income. This is nuts, absolutely nuts. And the biggest bitching and whining I get are from people over 70 who are loaded and say, if you do this to me, you're going to pay. I said this when I was in Congress. I took on the AARP 30 years ago. I said, any patriots in here or just panders? Or who's here? The AARP is 40 million people with a love of airline discounts and automobile discounts and unbelievable things to tap the Treasury. And if you get into and mess with them, but I'll just say to you, if you can't deal with Medicare, the rest of it is nothing. And I have tried. I've tried means testing. I think it's critical. You talk about that. So what I love to do at the age of 80 in September is just say to a guy my age, how much have you coughed up? Because you get into that game and you have found that people have been freeloading on this baby for years with no affluence testing, and that cannot continue. Either affluence test these benefits, and who are the people getting it, or it's collapsing by its own weight. So until you get serious about Medicare and contributions, and what I mean by that is those who have more will pay more. You can look at the situation. You look at the cost of operations. You look at the benefit structure. You look at your own cost. You look at everything in it. We take care of the most vulnerable in our plan, 80 to 85. We take it on up. We'll take care of that. But everybody's going to get in the game, and you're going to have affluence testing, and those who have more will pay more. And the gimmickry will end. And we couldn't do anything but find one little thing without the shrieking from all the groups. We had 103 groups testify. Every one of them said the country was headed for the bow wows, and not one of them said anything but don't touch us. Greedy bastards is a word. It's two words, actually. And I'm now people never clap when I speak. You're clapping now, but you'll get out and have a drink. You say, you heard that crazy bastard and what he said. It's funny, but it ain't funny. And you gotta do something with the mastodon in the kitchen, and that is Medicare. Medicaid in itself. Social Security, we're just trying to make it solvent. Defense, here's one for you. Try this one. Then you can throw it. There is a system in the Defense Department, healthcare, called TRICARE. I'm a veteran. Thank God, saved me from assassination. I went to Germany, and I was in the Army, the end of Army of Occupation. Here's this system. It's separate from Medicare. It's separate from the VA. And it's 2.2 million people are in it, all military veterans. And they contribute $2,450 a year. That's their premium, regardless of their net worth or their income. And no copay. and it takes care of their spouses and their children, and it costs $53 billion a year. And we tried to touch that. Gates tried to touch it. He got cremated by the VFW. I'm a lifetime member of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the American Legion, the Purple Heart, anybody you name just came out of the woodwork and said, we're patriots. I said, if you're a real patriot, you'll cough up some bucks, because as soon as you finish your 20 years of active duty, you probably went to work for the Defense Department. And the Defense Department will pay you bigger than anything you can find, and you can go into that at the age of 35. And then, keep bitching about your government. And you got to see it to believe it, but I'll tell you, this is a nation, and it's a wonderful nation. It's a nation of gimmickers. That's how we got to be successful. And let me tell you, there's no gimmickry better than the VA. And they're now 43, I don't know what the figure is, but let me tell you, every time you try to raise the premiums or the co-pays, here comes the VFW, I'm members of these groups, the VFW, you name them, here they come out of the woodwork, out of the trees like harpies from the cliff, for Christ's sake.
Can I make
I'll quit
Yeah.
before I rant. Rant.
We really should get to the, but I just want to make a small
let's
comment.
do that
'cause I have
and then the audience.
Here's the thing, a touch more arithmetic, and then I promise I'll stop. Every year, health spending per person grows about 2 percentage points faster than GDP per person. I'm trying to tie together a couple themes here. The arithmetic of that means that every year we spend a larger share of our economy on healthcare. That's what that means. As long as healthcare spending per person is growing faster than the economy per person, the arithmetic is that every year we spend a larger share of our economy on healthcare, public and private. The reason I wanted to say this is because I have a fundamental disagreement with Al on this point about Ryan. What Paul Ryan does is he shifts costs from the government to people. And Al's right when he says, if he's saying that this will lower the government's cost burden, because it shifts the costs from the government to the individual. And that may be, if that's the way you want to go, fine. I disagree with it, but that's a cost shift. What it doesn't do, and the CBO is very clear about this, Peter Orszag wrote a good article on this in Bloomberg in recent weeks, it doesn't change that cost ratio one bit. The costs, the spending continue to rise. In fact, according to CBO, kind of the scorekeeper we all have to tip our hats to on this stuff, according to CBO, the Ryan plan leads to significant increases in costs relative to other plans on the table. So it may lower the cost for government, but it doesn't get us out of that hole.
All right. Thank you very much. So we're going to open this up for the rest of the time for questions. We have a mic up here. I'm sorry we don't have a hand. Oh, great. So we have a way to get this around. So this gentleman right here, please. I'd like for our panelists, this is such a meaty topic, if we can keep these answers relatively tight, because I'd love to hear what we got on the minds of our audience.
Okay, jumping into Medicare. I've had the personal misfortune of multiple cancers in the last year, and so I've experienced the medical system firsthand. One time it took 5 phone calls to get the price of something, and then 2 months later when the bill came in, the price that I was given was wrong. And the observation I make about the U.S. medical system in general is that it is the least economic, most uncompetitive market within the United States, and that is probably the biggest reason for its huge percentage of our GDP. An alternative to single pay, go to the other end of the spectrum, is how do we introduce lots more competition, lots more economic incentives for efficiencies and innovation within the medical practice, and what are your views on that?
Al, why don't you start? That's a good question.
That's a very good question, and I agree with you completely. And I think the solution is not the single pay, because it will just reinforce the insulation of the consumer from the provider and the cost even more. I think the best, there's no perfect answer here. So, but I think the best answer of the imperfect answers that are there is today we spend, and Jared can give me the perfect number, I'm sure, but we spend The government, because of the tax exclusion on employer-provided health care, it costs the government about $250 or $300 billion a year because we don't pay income tax on that benefit. If we would take that money and convert it into a tax credit for everyone, every single person in America, and it would be about $5,500 for family coverage and $2,000 for individual coverage, and you could vary it based on age or health or whatever. But so everyone has a tax credit, and then individuals go out and buy the insurance they want. And because we need to get individuals caring about the cost and paying attention to the cost and getting rewarded if they can get it at a lower price. You know, the one part there are two parts of the healthcare that actually work. LASIK surgery. 15 years ago, LASIK surgery cost $2,500 a night. Today, it's less than $1,000. Why does it cost less? Because we pay for it and we shop. And so the market responds. And by the way, the doctors don't go to Congress and beg to get a higher reimbursement. They figured out how to do it more efficiently. Another area is plastic surgery. We pay for it. So when you go to get plastic surgery, you can notice I didn't get it on my nose. They give you a package price, and whatever they quote you, that's what you pay. But everything else is third-party pay. And as long as there's third-party pay, then we the consumers don't care, and the providers don't care about giving us that information. You know, what they care about is pleasing the people who pay them. So, you know, there are a lot. I can criticize the idea of the tax credits, but I think it's the best proposal that currently exists.
Anybody else before we move to the next question?
It has been a tough situation, and I do tend to rant from time to time because people come up and give me the business, and they're people who could get in the game. As I say, these 105 groups testified, all of them wringing their hands about what they were going to get out of the system, and then they said, don't touch anything here. There's no means testing or affluence testing. People say that's un-American. Well, I think it's un-American to draw money out of the Treasury when you don't need it. I think that's a hell of a lot more un-American, in my mind, twisted view, Wyoming view. But when you waddle up to the window to get your check, file your net worth. Well, that's totally un-American, Simpson. You rotten son. God almighty. Well, that's what's going to happen. And when your money is not at risk, you don't care. And I tell you, you can't believe this system where we dug into it, and it will break your heart to see the gimmickry that goes on in a system that was set up to take care of the most vulnerable people in society, and to see the people of worth and net worth take advantage of it as if they were picking crap with the chickens.
All right, other questions, please. How about that gentleman in the back? Yes, you, sir.
As you visitors might know, the new name of snowmass is snowmastodon. All of a sudden, we discovered million-year-old bone just outside of our little town. There's another elephant in the kitchen of this discussion. China has grown at double-digit figures for 3 decades, and we are very happy with 2 or 3. Just imagine if we could take 2 or 3% decrease in the trade deficit and apply those dollars to salaries for American workers. 20 years ago, I was chairman of a group very much like this. We talked about means testing men, and for 20 years, absolutely nothing has been done about it. I ask you please to consider, why are they not considering protecting our workers? And I will gladly become a protectionist to provide income to the great mass of workers. And I think your figure of 9% is very misleading. Those who haven't been able to find a job in 2 or 3 years, and those that are now working for a Walmart, are a disaster. So, gentlemen, please talk in 1 out of 5, not 9%.
Jared, why don't you open up with that, please?
I think you raise a lot of great points. The underemployment rate, if you include people who are working part-time when they would rather find full-time jobs, if you include people who are discouraged and gave up the search, they're not counted in the unemployed, is 16%. So you're right. And that even leaves out some of the folks you mentioned who are underemployed and that they're working, but in jobs that are, say, below their skill capacity. Look, you landed on a lot of different things. Let me just focus on one, which is China. I don't think it's protectionist to insist and even use government policy to enforce that exchange rates are set in global markets. That's free market economics, man. If anyone wants to call that protectionist, meet me outside afterward. Managing your currency, which a number of Asian economies engage in, so that your exports are cheaper and our imports are more expensive, is one of the reasons we have such persistently large trade deficits. That's not fair competition. Now, there's lots of different ways to go at it, and that's beyond the scope of our conversation. But it certainly relates to deficits. The trade deficit is as much a drag on growth as anything else. And there happens to be a really great bill in front of Congress. It's a bill that gives the administration the authority to go after currency management more aggressively. And this is a bill that got more bipartisan support. It was the last Congress, it wasn't this one, which is, wackier, but it was a bill that got 99 Republican votes in the House. And there are co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle in the Senate. And it's not a protectionist bill. It just says if people are managing their currency in the way I just described, that ain't right.
Other questions, please? How about over here? You, sir, in the green. Yep.
Two quick questions. Jared, why didn't President endorse Alan's plans on day one? I'm totally mystified by that. And then, Alan, I totally agree with you on we didn't pay for these wars. It's ridiculous. Why didn't you come up with the national security tax, a.k.a. the gasoline tax, to pay for what we really need to pay for? Thank you.
We have a gasoline tax in our study. In the 67-page report is a gasoline tax recommended. 15 cents? Well, I don't know, but, take a crumb when you can't get a loaf.
15 cents above what's already in the federal, right? The federal's already 18, so you mean 15
yeah,
cents more.
we suggested a tax on gasoline to stabilize the Highway Trust Fund. That's where it was supposed to come from instead of the General Treasury. We said, why is it coming out of the General Treasury? Kick it in until it comes back up to even balance and do that. But the first part of the question was what? I got so excited. The last part. What?
Why the president didn't embrace your plan on day one?
Well, I tell you why the president didn't do it on day one. Anybody who throws out the first plan gets savaged. Absolutely savaged. If it had been the AARP first, and they're sitting there, they're going to be all right. John Rother came out a few weeks ago and said, the ship is sailing and we want to be on it. Well, they immediately mugged him and threw him in an alley somewhere, and he's been the head of it for about 35 or 40 years. A good egg. But let me tell you, the administration of the AARP, and they live in a temple. You ought to go see their building in Washington. It's a temple. It's a beautiful thing. But they don't want people to go in it because they're working so hard in there that they don't want to be disrupted. And I don't know how many make over 150 grand, and there are 39 million members of the AARP, and man, oh man, they're tough. They'll beat you up with rolled up copies of Modern Maturity. And so, didn't answer the question there yet, did I?
How about if we let Jared?
Yes,
Jared's on the inside of that.
Oh, that's okay. We can.
No, I know.
Well, first of all, let me. Al is absolutely right what he said earlier about the but it wasn't. It's not like the I don't mean to imply, and I haven't been on the inside for weeks, so I want to be very careful about anything I say in this regard. It's not that the president, I think, has didn't like the plan and now likes it by any stretch. What I see, again, from the outside, is that there are elements of the plan that the president always thought was important, and as these budget negotiations heat up, he's embracing more of them. And in fact, if you look at the budget plan, the budget proposal, very broad, what do you call it, like almost like a budget resolution that the president proposed in April, it hitchhikes off a ton of this stuff in the fiscal commission plan. The bottom line is about $4 trillion in deficit reduction, about the same number they got to. The president gets there in 12, they get there in 10, big deal, doesn't matter. Lots of, some nuances. The one thing that comes to mind, and I worship at the altar of Senator Simpson and his plans, so don't get me wrong, but there's something in there I really don't like. I'm sorry to tell you. And that's the idea that they cap revenues at 21% of GDP. I think this is seriously a dangerous policy because we don't know what the future holds. We don't know what's out there in terms of attacks on our homeland. We don't know what's out there in terms of our environmental needs. We don't know what's out there in terms of, we do know what's out there in terms of demographics, and demographics are getting a lot more expensive. So the idea that the Fiscal Commission would cap revenues, have this rule that you could never collect more than 21% of the economy. I like that because, anything more than 21% sounds like a lot. I get that. I think the historical record is right around there. So I get the fact that you've tied this to history. But history is no guide as to what's coming. Just look at the demographic bubble. 21% won't do it. You have to consider demographics. So I think that was one reason to be wary of embracing really one of the fundamental aspects of the plan. And I don't mean at all to cast aspersions. There's a ton of great, courageous stuff in there. But that part, I think, was misguided.
So listen, I'd love to entertain more questions. That's part of the plan. We are so fortunate to have these three panelists. I'd like to close this thing out in the last 7 to 8 minutes. I'd like each of them to give a summary kind of statement. It's been fascinating to listen to them, so why don't we take it out on a really high note? Maybe we start with my colleague here, Al Hubbard. Just a couple of quick thoughts, and then we're out.
Thanks, and the questions were excellent, by the way. I hope that all of us in this election in 2012 will absolutely demand of our candidates that they be candid, not pander, be direct, and address directly how to deal with these problems. If they just avoid answering them, which is normal for politicians, then this election will be a failure. We have to force them to get on the record. President Obama needs to get on the record of what he's going to do about Social Security. What is he going to do about Medicare? How is he going to get the deficit under control? How is he going to raise more revenue? He wants to raise more revenue. Give us the specifics. And then the Republican candidate needs to do exactly the same thing. And then we will have a clear choice. And I will be happy with the election if it's a clear choice, and whichever way we go, that means that's the way the American people want to go. But I think we have to demand it of our candidates. And a frustration I have, and by the way, I've worked for politicians and been frustrated on the Republican side. So, and I, in private, will share that with you. But I wish President Obama would confront right now Social Security and say this is what we have to do, and confront Medicare and say this is what we have to do. And confront revenue raising, this is what we have to do. Confront defense, this is what we have to do. So that would be my close, and I think it really relies on each of us in this campaign because we do have disproportionate influence. We all know that because of our positions and our money and our interest and our engagement, that we insist that our candidates be candid, be direct, treat us as adults, and talk to us as an adult.
Thanks. Jared, how about you go next?
Okay. There are too many people in America who believe that a dollar spent by government is a dollar wasted. I'm talking about the broad middle class, people who are struggling, folks who haven't seen their incomes rise, even throughout expansions. The economy's grown and they've fallen behind. It's unlike the extent of inequality in this country is unlike anything I've ever seen. And yet, you can understand why they would be incredibly reluctant to send any one of their much-needed hard-earned dollars to Washington, which in their view wastes and squanders it. And that's at the root of why this discussion and debate is so hard. There's a lot of people with vested interests amplifying that conclusion, and that is wrong. There's a lot of things that government does well, a lot of things government does badly. And we need to decide what we want the size and role of government to do, what markets do least well, what government does best, and how we're going to amply fund that. I'm not saying it's easy, but that's the grown-up discussion I think that Al is suggesting we need to have, and I agree.
Thanks. I can't think of a better way to close this out than to hear from Senator Simpson after all the unbelievable experience and the straight talk. So, Senator, please.
I get in trouble because there's a fine line between good humor and smart aleck, and I try not to cross it, but I do. But let me tell you, this is very serious stuff. You better pray for Joe Biden and the Gang of Five, which was 6. But the only reason Coburn dropped out is so he could go whack on people. He's a good man. And if you can't get these 5 and the anterior 6, which is Coburn, and Joe Biden will come out of there with something because he doesn't waste his time. I've known Joe for 35 years. You don't have to like people anymore. This is crazy. You name a name and they say, I don't like that person. What the hell is that about? Forget it. We're all Americans. That's first. And you'll say, well, Joe Biden, hell, he's crazy. You know what? Let me tell you, and me too, I get that accolade. Or Joe, you remember Lloyd Benson spoke truth to power, and he was a wonderful guy. I just say to you this. I don't say these things now that I'm out. I said these things when I was in the U.S. Senate. I held hearings on the AARP. I was instructed not to do that, because they would kick my brains in, which they tried. These are the group, as I say, 40 million Americans bound together by airline discounts, and the ads now are about sex. This is the most fascinating thing. So they can't all be decrepit. It's a full pager the other day of some sleek gal about 28 years old in her underwear. I said, what's that about? Anyway, enough of that.
This is the X-rated portion of the show.
But the real issue is there are wonderful Americans ready to do something here. I held hearings on the AARP, and it was wonderful. My pals on both sides of the aisle came in and said, Al, thank you for holding this hearing. If I didn't have 3 other hearings right now, I'd be right here with you. Yeah, yeah, forget that. Anyway, what this fine man is saying, let me tell you what's crippling our country. It's what he speaks of it getting to 20 or 21 is now 15%. 15%. It should be 20 or 21. And because of Grover Norquist and the hystericals and all the rest, you cannot run your country on that kind of revenue. It's 15% now, should be 20. Historically was 20 to 21. And he gets up, and I'll tell you, if he wins the day, your grandchildren will be picking grit with the chickens. And you want to remember, I'm not kidding you. This guy, how he reached this position of power is beyond my comprehension. He's just one guy. I'm now checking into his net worth. He likes to probe everybody else's. Where does he get his money? About 6 sources of guys who just don't like to pay taxes, who are rich as hell. That's where he gets his money. So anyway, I would just say to you, we're not members of the AARP first, or the NRA first, or the NEA first, or the AFL-CIO first. We're Americans first, my God, and if we've forgotten that, we're going to have a hell of a tough haul.
Well said, Ryan.
Thank you to our panelists. That was a wonderful time, and thank you for joining us today.
Damn it.
Good job.
That was excellent.
I think that's...
Marn, Al Hubbard, yeah, nice to see you.
Thank you so much for your diligence with the mic.
Yeah.
100,000 people are going to
You have a place out here? Oh, that's great. Are you still working or retired? Yeah.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. It was.
Oh, did you pay for that?
Is that the one that?
Could you get it in the library?
Jim Nussel,